I remember the first time I saw my grandpa's land after buying it back. It felt like stepping into a memory. The road leading up to it was lined with towering pines, their needles glinting in the morning sun. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, a scent that instantly brought back images of me as a kid, running through the fields, trying to catch fireflies in mason jars while Grandpa shook his head, laughing. I parked my truck by the old barn, the one Grandpa had built with his own hands decades ago. Its wooden boards had weathered to a perfect gray, the roof sagging just slightly, like the land itself was sighing in relief to see me back. For a moment, I just stood there, letting nostalgia wash over me. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice, joking that I'd probably forget where I parked again. But then I noticed the envelope stuck in the mailbox. It wasn't like any friendly letter or welcome note I imagined finding, it was official. Stiff, white, and screaming bureaucracy in black letters, Homeowner Association. I pulled it out, turned it over in my hands, and sighed. Opening it, I felt that familiar mix of curiosity and dread. Inside, the HOA had written what they called a notice of noncompliance. Apparently my fence, the one I hadn't even built yet, was already wrong. I read the rules again. The fence had to be white, exactly 4 feet high, and every picket had to be spaced precisely 3 inches apart. Seriously, I muttered under my breath. Who measured fences down to the inch? The more I read, the more absurd it got. My mailbox had to be pastel green. My grass, according to them, could not exceed 3.2 inches in height. There were fines for unapproved bird feeders, and apparently my mailbox was facing the wrong direction, toward the wrong celestial body, I'm pretty sure. I laughed at first because it was almost comical. But then the humor faded when I realized this wasn't a joke. They expected me to comply immediately. I shook my head. This was my grandfather's land. The land he had worked, sweat over, and loved for decades. And now some self-important committee thought they could tell me how to live on it. I tossed the letter back into the mailbox, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. That's when I heard it, a rumbling of tires on gravel. I froze, straining to see down the long driveway. A white SUV was pulling up, tinted windows, the kind that screamed business serious enough to scare people. My stomach sank. As it got closer, I recognized the logo on the side, HOA Enforcement. My pulse jumped. The thought hit me, I wasn't alone on my own property. I parked my truck firmly, climbed out, and tried to appear calm. The SUV stopped near the edge of my property, and a man in a crisp polo shirt stepped out, clipboard in hand. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers followed, looking slightly confused, like they weren't sure why they were here. The HOA rep didn't waste time. "Good morning," he said, voice annoyingly cheerful. "I'm here to ensure compliance." I laughed nervously, more to keep my panic under control than anything else. "Compliance?" I asked. "I just bought this land legally. There's nothing to comply with. This is my grandfather's property." He didn't smile. "Ownership doesn't exempt you from the rules. You'll need to make several changes immediately, or we'll escalate this matter." I swallowed hard. This was real. Not a nightmare, not a prank, not a bureaucratic misunderstanding. They were here to enforce rules I hadn't agreed to, rules that didn't exist when Grandpa was alive. I tried to reason, but the officers just stood there, waiting, their hands awkwardly resting on their belts. I glanced at the rep, who was scribbling something on his clipboard like he was documenting a crime scene. My palms started sweating. And then, just as I was about to speak again, one of the officers whispered into a radio. I didn't hear the words, but his expression changed. My stomach dropped. Whatever they were planning next, it wasn't small. I looked around at my land, at the old barn, the trees, the memories etched into every corner, and I knew one thing, I wasn't leaving. Not today, not without a fight. And that's when the unease became something else. A quiet, simmering anticipation. Because this was just the beginning. I still remember the exact moment my stomach sank. The HOA SUV had stopped, and the trio of enforcers stepped onto my grandfather's land like they owned it. The sun glinted off their badges, clipboards, and polished shoes, and suddenly my peaceful field felt like a courtroom waiting to happen. "Good morning," said the HOA representative again, his tone syrupy sweet but with an undercurrent of menace. "We're here to ensure compliance with the neighborhood regulations." I stared at him blankly, unsure if I should laugh or call the cops on them. "Compliance," I said slowly. "I legally own this property, my grandfather's property. There's nothing here to comply with. You," I pointed to the clipboard like it might explain itself. "You don't even live here." The HOA rep ignored me. He gestured to the officers, who were standing stiffly like they'd been told they were part of an important ceremony, though neither seemed sure what it was. "You will vacate the property if you do not comply with the rules." Vacate, the word echoed in my head. Eviction, forced removal. I felt like I'd been thrown into some bad legal drama. "Excuse me," I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Evict me, from land I purchased legally, from the family that has owned it for generations." The rep tapped his clipboard. "Rules are rules. Your mailbox, your fence, your lawn, they are all in violation. Immediate action is required." I tried to suppress the urge to laugh, though my mind screamed, "Immediate action. You've literally been here 5 minutes." But the officers weren't laughing. They just stood there, blank faces, waiting. Their presence made everything feel heavier, more threatening. And then it happened, the first absurdity that made me realize just how ridiculous this whole situation was. One of the officers bent down to inspect my mailbox. "Pastel green, correct?" he asked, pen poised over a small notebook. I stared at him. "It's a standard metal mailbox." "Standard metal," the officer repeated, frowning as if I'd just insulted the entire postal service. The HOA rep scribbled something furiously on his clipboard. My mind flashed images of tiny fences, inch-by-inch grass measurements, and now a mailbox interrogation. I took a deep breath, trying to assert myself. "Look, I don't know how to make this any clearer. I own this land. I bought it back. You do not have the authority to remove me from my own property." The officer nodded slowly, still confused, while the HOA rep leaned closer, lowering his voice in what I assumed was supposed to be a threatening whisper. "You may think you own it, but the HOA has the final say on all compliance matters." I froze. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. "Never let anyone push you off what's rightfully yours." My pulse quickened. I could either back down and lose everything, or stand my ground, possibly angering this bureaucratic army. I chose to stand. "Then we'll see about that," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The rep's eyes narrowed. "We're documenting this encounter." He pointed at the officers like they were sworn paparazzi. I noticed one of them fiddling nervously with a camera. Were they seriously taking photos of my barn, my driveway, my grandfather's oak tree? Humor bubbled up despite the tension. I almost wanted to ask if they wanted a close-up of the mailbox too, but I swallowed it, knowing this wasn't the time for jokes. Then came the move that changed the entire tone of the morning. The HOA rep muttered something into a small radio clipped to his shirt. I couldn't hear the words, but the officers stiffened, glancing at each other, then at me. My stomach twisted. Whatever they were planning next, it was no longer casual intimidation. I stepped forward, planting my feet firmly. "I am not leaving," I said, louder this time, so the wind carried my words across the field. "I will not be bullied off my grandfather's land. You have no authority here." The rep's jaw tightened. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. A silent tension settled over the land, thicker than the morning fog. I could feel every heartbeat, every breath. Even the birds seemed to pause, waiting to see who would make the next move. And then the shadow of movement flickered near the barn. My eyes darted to it. Was it a stray animal? Another HOA scout? I couldn't tell. I gripped the truck keys like a lifeline. The rep straightened, his voice dripping with authority. "We will return, and if the violations remain, law enforcement will be involved." I swallowed hard. They left as abruptly as they had arrived, but the chill in the air lingered. The morning that had started with nostalgia and peace now felt like a battlefield. I walked the length of my property, scanning every corner, listening for any hint that they might come back immediately. My mind raced. What were my options? How far would they go? Could this end in a court battle, or worse, a confrontation I wasn't ready for? One thing was certain. The war over my grandfather's land had begun. And deep down, I knew I couldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. The morning after the first confrontation, I woke up to the smell of pine and damp earth, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But as soon as I stepped outside, the envelope from the HOA sat on the porch like a grim reminder. We are not finished with you. I knew one thing, this wasn't just about the fence or the mailbox anymore. They wanted to intimidate me and maybe even push me off my grandfather's land. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Not here, not now. I spent the first part of the morning packing the driveway, keeping a careful eye on the long gravel road that led to my property. Every car that passed made me tense. I felt like a kid hiding from bullies, except these bullies had uniforms, authority, and clipboards. Then in the distance, I saw movement. A familiar white SUV was creeping down the road. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the first visit, they were back. And this time, they weren't alone. As the vehicle pulled onto the gravel, my pulse started racing. 3 HOA reps stepped out again, clipboards in hand, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Their posture screamed control, but there was a hesitation in their steps, as if they weren't sure how I would react. "Good morning again," one of them said, overly cheerful as if they were greeting an old friend. I wasn't smiling. I planted my feet firmly, letting the gravel crunch under my boots. "I told you yesterday," I said slowly, letting each word land. "This is my land. I'm not leaving. You have no authority here. Not today, not ever." The rep's smile faltered slightly. "Rules are rules," he said, trying to regain the upper hand. "We're just here to ensure compliance." I snorted. "Compliance?" I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You want me to cut my grass to 3.2 inches and paint my mailbox pastel green? I think I'll pass." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. I noticed he kept glancing at the SUV, probably wondering why he was here too. Humor bubbled up in me despite the tension. I could almost imagine them whispering, "Why are we enforcing a garden policy on someone else's land?" But the humor didn't last. The rep leaned in, his voice low and sharp. "We've documented everything. If the violations are not corrected, law enforcement will take further action." I felt my heart sink a little. "Further action? You mean eviction?" I tried to sound calm, but my pulse thumped in my ears. "Yes," he said flatly. "You will vacate the property." I froze. Eviction, on my grandfather's land. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just ridiculous anymore, it was serious. And I could see in their faces that they expected me to comply without a fight. I clenched my fists. I wasn't leaving. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice in my head. "Stand your ground. They can't take what's yours if you don't let them." "Look," I said, taking a deep breath. "I bought this property legally. I have the deeds, I have the papers. You can't just—" I stopped short as one of the officers raised a hand, motioning for calm. Then, in an instant, one of the HOA reps started taking photos of the barn, the driveway, even the mailbox. I swallowed hard. They were building a case, or at least trying to scare me. I walked toward them slowly, hands visible, trying to show I wasn't a threat. "You want compliance? Here's compliance. Leave, go, I own this land." The tension stretched between us like a live wire. Even the birds seemed to hush, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed something near the barn, a shadow flickering in the corner of my eye. Someone or something was watching us. I didn't know if it was a neighbor spying, an HOA scout, or just a stray animal, but it made my pulse jump. The HOA rep straightened, muttering into his radio. I didn't hear the words, but the change in his demeanor was obvious. The officer stiffened. Whatever he said, it was serious. I felt my hands tighten around the truck keys. The gravel driveway suddenly felt like the battlefield, for something much bigger than fences or mailboxes. This was a war over my grandfather's legacy, and the first shots had just been fired. I backed toward my porch, keeping my eyes on them. I didn't know what their next move would be, but one thing was clear: I couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. And as the SUV pulled away slowly, I knew it wouldn't be the last time I'd see them. The real fight was just beginning. After the third encounter with the HOA, I realized something. This wasn't going to be resolved by reasoning, pleading, or passive-aggressive emails. This was war, bureaucratic war, but a war nonetheless. And in every war, you needed a plan. I spent that afternoon packing the driveway, letting the wind whip through my hair, trying to think clearly. The sun was warm, the birds chirped obliviously, and yet my mind raced faster than a wildfire through dry pine. How do you fight people who think clipboards are weapons and rules are more important than reality? The first step was obvious: knowledge. I had to understand every inch of the law that applied to my property. Ownership laws, HOA overreach statutes, precedent cases. I spent hours scouring legal websites, reading forums where people recounted stories eerily similar to mine. Some had fought HOAs and won. Others, well, let's just say the horror stories were long enough to fill a small library. I scribbled notes furiously in a tattered notebook Grandpa had left me. Document everything. Every visit. Every photo. Every ridiculous threat. Even if it's minor, it counts, I muttered to myself, packing like a general preparing for battle. Humor was the only way to survive the insanity of it all. I practiced my courtroom lines in front of the barn mirror, gesturing dramatically with my hands. Your Honor, this is my land, my grandfather's legacy, and I will not be bullied by a self-righteous HOA. My dog, Duke, watched me like I had finally lost my mind, ears perked, tongue lolling, as if silently judging my acting skills. I also had to prepare mentally. The HOA had already shown they could escalate quickly. The first confrontation had been unsettling, the second intimidating, and the third, well, it made me realize they were methodical, maybe even obsessed with control. I had to be smarter, faster, and more prepared. Then came the calls. The HOA president, whose voice was the very definition of faux charm, called me directly. "We'll see you in court soon," he said, his tone calm but threatening. "And trust me, you'll regret ignoring our warnings." I hung up and stared at my hands. He didn't know me. He didn't know that my family's roots in this land ran deeper than his rules. I felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just property anymore, it was legacy. It was family. It was personal. I spent the evening gathering my grandfather's documents, purchase deeds, tax receipts, even old letters showing continuous ownership. Every piece of paper was a small weapon in my arsenal. Every photograph of Grandpa building the barn, planting trees, walking through the fields, evidence that this land had a history, a heartbeat, and a rightful owner. But the real challenge was strategy. I needed a courtroom plan. Who would speak first? How would I respond to their overblown claims? What if they brought in surprise witnesses? I paced the barn floor like a general studying a battlefield map. At some point, I realized I needed allies. I called a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. She listened to my story, chuckled at some of the HOA's ridiculous demands, and promised me this: they may try intimidation. They may try loopholes, but if your documents are in order, you have a strong case. Just stay calm, stay factual, and don't let them push you into panic. I took a deep breath and tried to imagine the courtroom scene. The judge's eyes, the HOA president flustered and sweating, me standing firm with evidence in hand. I even practiced subtle humor in my mind, like the part where I'd describe their obsession over a mailbox that faced the wrong direction. But there was a shadow hanging over all of it, a nagging worry that they had one more trick up their sleeves, a surprise that I hadn't anticipated. And that uncertainty kept me up at night, staring at the old ceiling beams, imagining someone sneaking onto the land in the dark. I checked the driveway again. Quiet. The moonlight bathed the barn in silver, but I couldn't shake the tension. This wasn't a regular night. This was the calm before the storm. I made a silent vow. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't intimidated. And I certainly wasn't letting a bunch of clipboard-wielding bureaucrats destroy the legacy my grandfather had built. The plan was set. The documents were ready. My resolve was ironclad. And the next morning, I knew the real battle was waiting. One that would take place not on the fields, not in the barn, but in a courtroom. The morning of the court date, I woke up with a knot in my stomach the size of a bowling ball. It wasn't fear exactly, not the kind that makes your knees shake, but the kind that makes your heart pound like it's trying to escape your chest. I knew what was at stake: my grandfather's land, my family's legacy, everything that had shaped me, all resting in the hands of a stranger in a black robe. I paced the living room of my rented motel room near the courthouse, documents spread across the table like battle plans. Deeds, tax records, old letters, photographs, every piece of paper was a weapon, every signature a shield. I memorized dates, facts, and details, rehearsing my lines quietly under my breath. "Your Honor, this property has been in my family for generations," I whispered, gesturing toward the table as if the lawyer papers were an audience. Humor helped calm my nerves. I imagined the HOA president, sitting in the courtroom with his absurdly perfect hair and starched suit, trying to act serious while I calmly dismantled every argument he'd made in those ridiculous letters. I chuckled quietly, picturing him frantically scribbling notes on the same clipboard that had been his weapon of intimidation. My dog, Duke, resting at my feet, tilted his head, as if silently judging my dramatic monologue. But there was no time for too much levity. The HOA had already threatened surprise witnesses and escalation if I didn't comply. I didn't know who they might bring: neighbors, surveyors, maybe even some random person they'd convinced to testify against me. I had to prepare for anything. I double-checked everything: the deed proving I purchased the property, photographs of Grandpa building the barn, and old tax records proving uninterrupted ownership. Every single document had to be perfect. I also prepared a timeline of HOA visits, every date, every absurd claim, every photo they'd taken. Because in court, the story is just as important as the facts. By late morning, I made my way to the courthouse, a nervous excitement bubbling under my skin. The building loomed tall and intimidating, its stone walls echoing with the footsteps of people fighting battles much bigger than mine. As I entered, I passed a few familiar faces: some attorneys, a handful of HOA members, and surprisingly, a few locals who'd probably heard about the ridiculous fight over the 3.2-inch grass rule. A smirk tugged at my lips. I wasn't alone. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, but it had all the theatrics of a drama. Dark wood paneling, leather benches, the judge's desk raised higher than the rest, perfect for maximum intimidation. I took a deep breath and walked to my assigned spot, laying out my documents carefully. My hands trembled slightly, but I steadied them, focusing on the task at hand. The HOA president entered, his confident stride faltering slightly when our eyes met. I held my gaze, letting him feel that silent, unspoken challenge. I was not afraid, and I was ready. Behind him, the officers who had visited my property were seated awkwardly, unsure where to look. Then the judge arrived. Silence fell over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. I swallowed and tried to steady my racing heart. The judge's eyes scanned the room, then rested on me. "We're here today regarding the dispute over property located at," the case began. The HOA lawyer went first, presenting a flurry of rules, regulations, and supposed violations. I tried not to roll my eyes as he dramatically waved the letters, as if the weight of bureaucracy itself could overwhelm the truth. I could almost hear Duke's voice in my head: focus, facts, calm. When it was my turn, I stood, taking a deep breath. I laid out the documents methodically, explaining the purchase, the history of ownership, and Grandpa's continuous care for the land. I spoke with a mixture of calm and determination, letting the absurdity of some of their claims speak for itself. I recounted the visits, the threats, the photo documentation, all in a steady, factual tone. But the real tension came when the HOA attempted their surprise witness. A neighbor stepped up, looking uncomfortable, clearly coached. I listened carefully, nodding politely, then asked one simple question that cut through the rehearsed testimony. Were you personally present when any violation occurred? Silence. The witness faltered. Their credibility crumbled. I could feel the courtroom shifting. The judge's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The HOA president's confident smirk began to waver. The officers who had visited my property yesterday shifted in their seats, unsure what was happening. And then I realized something important. The fight wasn't just about documents or laws. It was about standing firm, presenting the truth calmly, and letting the absurdity of their behavior unravel naturally. I was no longer just defending land. I was defending my grandfather's legacy, my family's memory, and my own sense of justice. By the time I sat down, I could feel the tension in the room, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't going to be easy for them. But I also knew that I had planted the seeds of victory. The next part of the trial, the moment that would truly test both sides, was just beginning, and I could feel it in my chest. The turning point was coming. The courtroom felt heavier than ever that morning, like the air itself was charged with anticipation. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every shuffle of papers, made my heart thump a little faster. I could see the HOA president sitting there, posture perfect, lips pressed together in a smug line, clearly expecting his usual intimidation tactics to work. But I wasn't intimidated, not this time. The judge called the session to order, his eyes sweeping across the room like a hawk inspecting its prey. We are here to hear the case regarding the property at. His words floated over the room, but my focus was sharp. I knew every single fact that mattered. Every date, every document, every visit from the HOA was etched into my memory like battlefield strategy. The HOA lawyer rose first, clearly confident. He began with the usual theatrics, a litany of supposed violations, rules broken, fines unpaid, absurd demands about lawn heights and mailbox colors. He waved letters like they were evidence of a crime, and I couldn't help but smirk ever so slightly. One of the officers who had visited my property yesterday glanced at me, perhaps noticing my calm demeanor, maybe questioning why I wasn't shaking in fear. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, letting the weight of the room settle on me. The judge's eyes were sharp, watching, evaluating. I took a deep breath and started speaking, calm but firm. "Your Honor," I said, "this property has been in my family for generations. I legally purchased it from the previous owner. These so-called violations are not just frivolous, they're attempts to intimidate a rightful owner from his land." I laid out my evidence systematically. The deed proving the purchase, photos of Grandpa building the barn, old tax records showing continuous ownership. I spoke in a steady voice, letting the absurdity of some of the HOA's claims show through naturally. I even mentioned lightly the exact measurement obsession over the mailbox and grass, letting a hint of humor lighten the tension, but not so much that it seemed disrespectful. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. Then came the surprise witness. I braced myself, imagining someone ready to throw everything into chaos. A neighbor stepped forward, looking visibly uncomfortable. Their answers were hesitant, uncertain, and clearly coached. I asked one simple question: "Were you personally present when any violation occurred?" The answer was a stammering, "No." A subtle shift happened in the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly, interest flickering in his eyes. The HOA president's confident posture started to falter, his smug smile twitching into a worried grimace. I could feel the tension, thickening like fog in the room. I pressed on, walking the line between assertive and calm. "Your Honor, I have documented every interaction with the HOA, including visits, photos, and letters. The evidence shows that their claims are not just exaggerated, they are entirely unsubstantiated." I paused, letting the silence sink in. Every eye was on me now. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, but it gave me focus, not fear. The HOA lawyer tried to interrupt, waving his arms dramatically. I let him speak for a moment, letting the theatrics highlight how over-the-top and desperate their case had become. Then I calmly refocused, addressing the judge. "This is not just about property rules. This is about respecting ownership, legacy, and the law. My grandfather built this land with his hands, and I will not allow it to be taken away through intimidation and bureaucracy." The courtroom seemed to lean in, holding its collective breath. Even the officers from the previous visits shifted uneasily in their seats. They probably hadn't expected me to come prepared or to present everything so calmly and decisively. Finally, the judge asked a pointed question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Has any violation actually caused harm or legal concern beyond these notices? I nodded firmly. No, Your Honor. The property has always been maintained responsibly. All claims are purely administrative and exaggerated to harass me as the rightful owner. The judge's gaze lingered on the HOA president, who opened his mouth to reply and then closed it again, speechless. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as the reality of the situation sank in. Their intimidation tactics were failing. I sat down slowly, heart racing but steady. The tension in the room remained, thick and heavy, but I knew I had done everything I could. The next step, the judge's ruling, would decide if all this preparation, all this tension, and all my courage would pay off. And as the judge reviewed the documents, leaning back in his chair with a contemplative frown, I could feel the turning point approaching. The moment of truth was near. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every heartbeat feel louder than a drum. I could feel the tension wrapping around the room like thick fog. The HOA president sat rigid in his chair, clearly expecting some trick, some loophole, some miraculous loophole to save his case. But I knew the truth, and truth has a way of cutting through even the most polished facades. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, scanning the documents I had laid out. His eyes flicked toward the HOA lawyer, then back at me. "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties," he said, voice calm but firm. "And I have one question before we proceed. Has anyone provided verifiable, first-hand evidence of actual violations?" The HOA lawyer sputtered. He waved his hands, muttered something about precedent and administrative authority, but his argument faltered under the weight of the evidence. I could almost see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Humor bubbled up despite the tension. I imagined him trying to measure my grandfather's mailbox with a ruler from across the room. Then came the HOA's so-called surprise witness. A neighbor had been called to testify about supposed violations. They stepped up, looking pale and uneasy, like a rabbit caught in headlights. Their statements were hesitant, contradictory, and clearly coached. I could sense the doubt spreading, seeping into the courtroom's atmosphere. I asked the crucial question, steady and calm. "Were you personally present when any violation occurred?" "No," the witness admitted, voice barely audible. That single word was like a crack of thunder. It echoed through the room. The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward. The HOA president's confident smirk faltered, his shoulders tensing. I could see him silently calculating, realizing that the house of cards he had built was starting to collapse. I spoke next, packing slightly to let my points sink in. "Your Honor, these claims have no basis in reality. My grandfather maintained this land responsibly. I purchased it legally, and every assertion of noncompliance is either exaggerated or completely unfounded. The HOA's repeated threats, visits, and notices are a clear attempt to intimidate me rather than address any legitimate issue." The judge nodded thoughtfully, scanning the stack of documents. "It seems the claims lack substance," he said, voice low, almost conversational, "especially in light of the evidence provided by the property owner." I felt a rush of relief, but I kept my expression calm, aware that the battle wasn't officially over. The HOA lawyer tried one last desperate maneuver, pointing at a technicality in the rules, citing obscure bylaws and clauses no one had ever read carefully. But it was too late. The judge was clearly unimpressed. He asked for a final word from the HOA president. I watched as the man stood, took a deep breath, and fumbled through his notes. His voice wavered as he tried to assert authority. "Your Honor, we maintain that these rules apply universally." The judge cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. Your claims are unsubstantiated. The property owner has presented sufficient evidence of legal ownership and proper maintenance. The HOA may not enforce compliance in this manner. Silence, then the words I'd been waiting for. The court rules in favor of the property owner. I couldn't help it. I laughed, quietly at first, then louder, a mix of relief and triumph. My grandfather's land, my family's legacy, was safe. The HOA president sat stunned, face red, staring at the floor. The officers who had visited me looked awkward, unsure how to process the sudden reversal of power. I gathered my documents slowly, savoring the moment. Every visit, every threat, every absurd letter, it had all led to this. I felt like a general surveying the battlefield after a victorious campaign. Humor returned in small doses. I imagined the HOA president measuring air with a ruler, trying to find some imaginary violation that didn't exist. The judge offered a final warning. The HOA must refrain from any further harassment or attempts to enforce these rules against me. Any future attempts would be considered contempt of court. That was the icing on the cake. As I left the courtroom, documents clutched in my hand, a wave of adrenaline and satisfaction washed over me. The sun was bright, the streets alive with the normal chaos of city life, but I felt like I was walking on air. My grandfather's land, my home, my memories, it was all mine. And even though the HOA had tried everything, they couldn't take what was rightfully mine. They had underestimated me, underestimated the law, underestimated the strength of legacy and persistence. I smiled quietly to myself. The battle wasn't just over land, it was about respect, justice, and standing firm when others tried to bully you. I glanced toward the driveway, half expecting one last stunt, one final attempt at intimidation. But the street was quiet. For now, at least, the fight was over. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Sunlight fell on the steps, warm on my face, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without that tight knot of tension in my chest. The air seemed sweeter, the birds louder, and every car that passed sounded like a victory parade. I clutched the stack of documents. The deeds, the photos, the letters, all proof that my grandfather's land was legally mine and that no clipboard-wielding HOA enforcer could take it away. The weight of it all had finally lifted, replaced by a satisfying thrill. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of the HOA president sitting in court, stunned, speechless, and probably rethinking every decision he'd ever made about my property. Driving back to the land, I felt a rush of anticipation. The old barn came into view, bathed in late afternoon sunlight. The trees swayed gently, and for a moment, it was as if the land itself was welcoming me home, acknowledging the victory as if it had been waiting for me to prove I belonged here. I stepped out of my truck and let the wind hit my face, taking in every detail. The mailbox still leaned slightly to the right, the fence posts were crooked in places, and the grass was definitely taller than HOA regulations would allow. But for the first time, none of that mattered. This was my land, and I could finally enjoy it without the constant stress of surveillance and threats. I walked slowly along the driveway, feeling the earth under my boots and the history under my hands. Grandpa had built this place with sweat, pride, and a stubbornness that ran in the family. Standing here, victorious, I realized I had inherited more than land. I had inherited resilience, patience, and the ability to fight for what's right. As I reached the barn, I couldn't resist a little humor. I imagined the HOA president standing somewhere far away, measuring invisible grass, obsessing over mailboxes, and trying to find a reason to keep their case alive. I laughed quietly to myself, Duke at my side, tongue lolling like he understood the absurdity. "Sorry, buddy," I whispered. "No one's taking this land from us now." The next few days were quiet, almost peaceful. No more letters. No more visits. The HOA had officially been reminded of their boundaries, and every communication I received was strictly professional and limited. I felt like I'd finally earned a small victory not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever been bullied by bureaucracy. Sitting on the porch one evening, Duke resting at my feet, I reflected on the journey. It wasn't just about the court case or the absurd rules. It was about standing up, asserting rights, and protecting something that mattered deeply. And it had taken courage, preparation, and a little bit of humor to survive the madness. I thought about Grandpa, smiling at the thought of him shaking his head at the ridiculousness of the HOA. I could hear his voice clearly in my mind. "You did good, kid. Never let anyone push you off what's yours." Those words had carried me through every intimidating visit, every tense moment in court, and every sleepless night of preparation. I also realized something else. This victory wasn't just mine. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's necessary. Bureaucracy, intimidation, and rules can't replace honesty, fairness, and determination. And while I'd hope I never had to face another HOA battle like this, I knew I had the tools, the courage, and the resolve to do it again if needed. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting golden light over the barn, the fence, and the fields, I felt a profound sense of peace. My grandfather's land was safe, my family's legacy secure, and for the first time in weeks, I could just breathe. I smiled at Duke, who wagged his tail like he knew the fight was over, and whispered, "We did it, boy, we really did it." And in that quiet moment, I realized something important. Victory isn't just about winning the battle. It's about proving to yourself that you're willing to fight for what matters, no matter how absurd, frustrating, or daunting the challenge may be. I looked out over the land, the barn, the crooked fence, and the wildflowers, feeling a deep connection to the past, the present, and the future. This land wasn't just soil and timber, it was family, history, and heart. And now, after everything, it was ours. For the first time in weeks, I laughed aloud, a pure, free sound that echoed across the fields. The HOA might have thought they could intimidate me, but in the end, they'd underestimated one thing: the power of persistence, preparation, and pride in what's rightfully yours. And that, I realized, was the best kind of victory. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.